So that's how you rank the tiny ones?
Yes, of course.
What about the long ones?
I don't have a list for that, sorry.
Then how about the ones that wear hats?
I don't think many of them wear hats.
Oh, well, what about the old ones?
Oh, no, that one I can do.
Ladies, gentlemen, and
Monsters of all ages, welcome one and all to your excuse to get angry at me. In Monster Hunter, one of the most cared about things in general is the monsters themselves. Everyone has their favorites and their least favorites, because no matter how good something is as a standard, there is always a top and a bottom. And for individual people, that top and that bottom will change as well. Today, I will be going over my personal tier list of the Elder Dragon monsters in the entire Monster Hunter series, excluding the subspecies that don't really change much, and in the process of doing this, I'm sure that no one will disagree with my personal choices whatsoever in the slightest. Starting off then with Lao Shenlong in the F tier. Sorry Lao, I know you were the first giant monster, but you're just an oversized punching bag with the skin of a Rathalos stretched over you. I don't find your design to be particularly unique. I don't think that your fight is really that enjoyable either, and maybe one day a Lao Shenlong could be remade in a way that makes me like him, but as it stands, he just sort of exists in the Monster Hunter universe. He is entirely unspecial, at least as far as I'm concerned. Up to the D tier then, sorry Lao, you were the only one down there, Jen Moran. This monster is a really cool concept, but I don't find them all that aesthetically pleasing, and the fight itself, while interesting on the surface, leaves a lot to be desired. It's a siege fight, yes, but it's a siege fight with about the smallest possible amount of actual weapon-hitting monster interaction possible. And while the concept of the sand boat fight is really cool in theory, in practice, the actual novelty of the experience wears off pretty quick. After him is, of course, Daren Moran, who is, well, very close to the same monster. In fact, my memory finds them barely distinguishable from each other, besides a difference in the number of spiky face appendages. They just did him again with a slightly revamped fight and called it a whole new monster, let's be honest here. Then comes Sadeas, which pains me to put here because I fucking love whales.
What did you just say?
I think whales are a fantastic animal, and I love the way that Sadeas looks, and I love Sadeas' lore and the way that you're not actually supposed to kill him, you're just breaking his horns because he's growing over his face and he's angry and he's hitting his head on something. You know what? I just talked myself into bumping him all the way up to A. Fuck it, I do what I want. I love Sadeas. His fight is boring, but everything else is really cool. A. Next, in D tier then, is Zorah Magdaros. I recently talked to you all in defense of Zorah Magdaros, saying how underrated that I think he is, and I do genuinely believe that. I stand by that. I think Zorah is a really cool monster. However, his fight is pretty boring, and this list is to compare the best Elder Dragon to the worst Elder Dragon. Within that spectrum, unfortunately, I do think Zorah places relatively low. After him is Dire Morales, another concept I think is great with a fight that I find quite boring, even if it is much harder than Zorah Magdaros is. He's just another walking volcano, and even though you are using your weapon, it doesn't really feel like you're fighting him, you're just fighting glowing spots that show up on his body. Moving up to the C tier then, we have Kulve Taroth. This one is pretty hard for me to place because I just can't think of Master Rank Kulve here. I have to also consider the whole siege surrounding the base version of her. I think her general design is pretty cool. It's not top tier. She's sort of just a lizard under the golden cloak, but she is also wearing a golden cloak and she's a very pretty monster, no doubt about it. Hey there, Kulve. The siege mechanic was cool at first to get the feeling of having 16 players all working together towards one goal, but it got pretty stale quite fast, and it just felt like a barrier to entering the actual fight part of the fight with the monster. All of that considered, I'm pretty happy with this one being at C tier. Next up is Crimson Fatalis. Yeah, I know, this is where things will start to get a bit rough, but I cannot overemphasize that this list is comparing Elder Dragons to each other. Crimson Fatalis is far lower than Base Fatalis on this list, and that is entirely due to its fight. The monster is decent looking. I'm not big on the whole lore of Fatalis, and I don't consider its design overly cool, so much as just sort of standard dragon. Crimson Fatalis doesn't really make that much better, so much as it does just adjust it a little bit. And then the fight is unfortunately unfortunately very much the outdated old game Fatalis fight with a few extra bells and whistles. I never found this monster overly impressive. In fact, compared to its lore, it disappointed me quite a bit. After him is, well, the White Fatalist, for almost exactly the same reasons. He is absolutely a little bit better than Crimson Fatalis, but most of that is just in the one attack where he flies into the sky, which is neat, but that is one attack. It just doesn't really swing it back in his favor for me in the slightest. Following that is Nergigante. A lot of people consider him to be in the upper echelon of Monster Hunter monsters as a whole. I do consider him to be in the top 20% or so of overall monsters, probably, but in the C tier of my Elder Dragon tier list. His design is intimidating and cool. His fight is extremely learnable, which is quite rewarding, but once you've experienced what the series has to offer, he really just isn't incredibly unique. He doesn't do anything that makes you go, oh man, this creature is just something super special, at least not for me personally. After him then is Runer Nergigante. This one is sort of weird. It's both an up and a down from base Nergigante. The fight is cooler, the aesthetic is arguably cooler looking, but I just cannot for the life of me get it past my suspension of disbelief that Nergigante could grow essentially metallic spikes for some reason. The bone spikes were pretty badass. It felt realistic, even if a bit extreme. The metal just feels totally alien entirely to me. Next up then is Nakarkos. Sorry, I know, design-wise he is really cool. A little skeletal cuttlefish. Okay, big skeletal cuttlefish. When we first had him show up, it appears to be a monster with two heads, but in the end they turn out to simply be the tentacles of a much bigger beast. That reveal definitely adds quite a bit to the memorability of Nakarkos, but this is the first part of this list where I'm just gonna say that this monster is not for me. It feels like it just leans a bit too hard into areas that I'm not a huge fan of in monsters. The bone aesthetic is a bit crazy for me. The fight itself, while interesting, isn't anything to write home about. It's just not something that I enjoy on a personal level. Following that up is Velkhana, who I struggled with where to put. Her design, absolutely top tier. I love it. Ice dragon that uses ice particles to create ice armor and weaponry on their own icy body. That is absolutely badass. The fight itself, it makes me unhappy. Not in the way that it is hard, so much as I just find it frustrating. It's not difficult, just annoying. It's hard to put it a better way than that. It's things like the base things like her ice beam goes through her own ice walls without breaking the ice walls. It just clips through. It just really takes away from the creature as a whole for me. After this, we move on up to the B tier with a little bit of Valhazak. I love Valhazak. It's such a cool monster, a great design, very intimidating, and yes, he is quite edgy, but it is built up in a way where the entire area around him, the entire zone, the map that he lives on, gives him ecological support for his edginess, so that sort of makes it okay. Where Valhazak falls down, though, is his fight. While it has some cool moments, it is just sort of agonizingly slow, to the point where he became the free farm monster at the end game of Monster Hunter World due to how easy it was to avoid his attacks and hit him back. Next up then is Teostra. This may be a little bit low for some people, but I don't consider Teostra to be all that much hot stuff. He is pretty cool, but to me, he's just too close to the barrier of a regular video game boss. Most Monster Hunter monsters would never exist in another game. They're way too weird for it, but fit in just right here. But Teostra has a sort of standardized feeling to him, I guess. An explosive lion dragon who looks eternally familiar to me, and nothing about him makes me really like him more than anything listed after this point on the list, including Kirin. Yeah, even Kirin, whose fight annoys me to no end, no doubt about it, which is why it is sort of in the middle, because Kirin otherwise is a really cool creature. A lightning unicorn that moves faster than the eye can actually see, and just has complete control over thunder as its only real weapon. No source of power other than harnessing the elements around it, but still noted as being a very powerful creature. That makes it a badass. Mostly, this one is just here because the fight causes me great pain. Following that up is Amatsu, the Storm Dragon. This creature has a design that I recognize as being very regal and awesome, and I just don't really like it all that much myself. I would call this monster objectively pretty, but all the frills or fins or whatever just don't do it that much for me personally, and the face is super long and pointy. The fight is cool, but I don't gel with the design all that much, so this one is a B tier Elder Dragon for me. After that is our good old friend, the Tar Dragon, Gogmazios. Now, my opinion on him is a bit limited because while I have seen his fight in action, I have not fought him myself. I think his design is really fun. I mean, he's just an amalgamation of Monster Hunter weaponry fighting back against you with sticky laser beams, but the fight from the perspective that I have seen it has seemed a little bit lackluster, at least in comparison to some of the things that appear further on into this list, even things such as Xeno'jiiva. This monster, the first time that you see it, definitely leaves a mark. It looks almost alien in its fresh out of the egg state, and this fight is positively spectacular the first time that you do it. It feels so cinematic, and unfortunately, I think that is about the limit of this fight. I don't consider it a particularly well-constructed Monster Hunter fight, mechanically speaking. I just think that it is a cool monster that is incredibly cinematic, hence its position on the list. Next up is one of our newest monsters to the group, Wind Serpent Ibushi. I think this monster is really crazy, honestly. He's unlike anything before him, with the closest comparison being Amatsu, who I've already talked about, except that he is quite a bit thicker and works quite a bit different mechanically. He puts down little wind tunnels that are fun to play around with, but otherwise his fight is pretty slow and not overly engaging. He rides quite high on his design, being spectacular in my opinion, and his fight being well above average without being incredible per se. Following that up, we move to the A-tier monsters on the list. Moving past Sadeas, who I already put on here, let's talk about Dalamadur. I always struggle to talk about Dalamadur because he's another one that I have never fought, and I feel like you never really get the right impression of his fight from just watching someone else do it or even talking to people about it. But design-wise, I absolutely adore this monster. I am a sucker for giant snake monsters, and Dalamadur is a very giant, very snake, very monster type of creature, so his design does a lot of good for me. For what I know though, the fight was not particularly enjoyable by any means, and this is the reason that this monster isn't even higher up on the list for me. After that comes Kushala Daora, who got a nice refurbishment in Monster Hunter Rise that completely made me gain a whole new respect for him. His design is pretty cool, it always has been. A dragon whose base design is around being made of a nearly metallic scale is pretty cool, especially for when he originally was put in the series quite early on. But in Monster Hunter Rise, they actually made the fight cool too. Not just cool, but also fun. It is both enjoyable and interesting, and that is just an ideal combination for a monster. Next up is Black Veil Valhazak. While it loses the matching ecosystem of regular Valhazak, it gains the entire spore theme that it has going on as a fungus-based creature instead of the effluvium it used before. The way that it leans into this theme and the way that the map itself changes color when you are fighting this monster is really neat, and the fight is much better than base Valhazak as well, in my opinion. It has some annoyances too, but undoubtedly it is just a better fight overall than its predecessor and much deserves to be higher up in this list. Following that is Thunder Serpent Narwa. This monster looks pretty. The floating animations are just absolutely godly. I mean, it makes it feel like this creature is on an entirely different level to the hunter. It literally fights upside down sometimes, for fuck's sake, and it looks great while doing it. The color scheme is nice, and the fight has a large number of cool moments and progresses in an interesting way. This is an end boss fight that doesn't feel stale the second time that you fight it, but still has that massive spectacle feeling the first time that you fight it. It perfectly strikes that balance. After this comes Safi'jiiva. I did love all my time fighting Safi'jiiva, and I had a lot of time fighting Safi'jiiva. It was a cool fight that definitely made better use of the siege system than Kulve did, but it still did use the siege system, which just sort of made anything less engaging for me. Visually, this creature is pretty cool, but somewhat bland outside of when it is sucking energy out of the ground and in the last phase of the fight itself. Speaking of the fight, that is where this thing really shines. I love the Safi'jiiva fight. I love monsters that are oversized, but still feel like they are actually fighting you rather than you are attacking a brick wall, and Safi'jiiva is exactly that. Next up, rounding off the A tier, is Lunastra. I know maybe it's weird that I have held her in such higher regard than Teostra, but this is my personal list, and it's just how I feel. Whereas in my mind, Teostra is sort of just a basic fire dragon, Lunastra takes the concept of a fire dragon, turns it blue instead of red, makes it all about the moon, and has so many crescent-shaped animations to represent that. She has a really cool cool, unique individual mechanic that creates fire patches on the floor that can not only chain to each other, but also block ranged attacks and also combine with Kashala de Aura's tornadoes to make blue fire tornadoes. It's incredibly involved. It is very passionately designed by the people who made the game. It feels incredible, and I love the creature as a whole. Lunastra is just a monster that I think I do personally like way more than the average person does. Starting off the S tier then with speed is Valstrax. This monster has grown on me over time. Originally I struggled to accept that this monster existed. After all, he sort of feels like a Frankenstein's creation rather than a regularly evolved biological creature, but after long enough being a Monster Hunter fan, I just sort of said fuck it, and I love all the ridiculous stuff too. It's just great. Valstrax is ridiculous, but he is also a goddamn jet plane dragon, which is just really freaking cool. His fight is great, and Crimson Glow Valstrax in Monster Hunter Rise is basically just Valstrax 2.0. Pretty much just gave him a nice little update more than a full-on change, and well, it's great. He's fun, and I love his design. After him comes Base Fatalis, who is entirely up this far above his counterparts due to the updated fight that he got at the end of Iceborne. This fight is objectively one of the best made fights in all of Monster Hunter. I won't dare say that it's top 5, top 10, top 20, whatever, but it's undeniably an incredibly well-crafted experience even within this series of well-crafted fights. The fact that it was given to Fatalis is almost a secondary factor. It could have been any monster treated the exact same way given this fight, and I would think it is an absolute masterpiece of Monster Hunter combat, but it was Fatalis presented in this way, and so it redeemed a lot of my issues with the monster from previous games where he didn't at all feel like he lived up to his reputation. Now, Fatalis undeniably does live up to said reputation. Following that is Yamasukami, another monster that I haven't fought, but I just don't care. This monster isn't about the fight, at least not for me. This monster on design alone has been something that I consider within my top monsters of all time since the first day that I laid my eyes on him. A giant floating goddamn octopus monster covered not only in moss, but also in a vague tree line because a forest basically grows on his back as a result of all the soil that he eats. Because he eats soil by just soaking in entire areas, and that is just so cool. There is so much to love about him to the point where even if I considered the fight a 0 out of 10, I would still consider the monster as a whole a 9 out of 10. I adore this design. After that is Allmother Narwa, the ultimate version of this fight in Monster Hunter Rise, and I do mean ultimate. It simply feels better than normal Narwa and better than Ibushi and uses a cool mix of both of their abilities. The creature looks really cool once it all gets going, and the area itself used to present the fight is full of endemic life for you to play around with to really get to play around in this arena with the Allmother Narwa fight. This fight is brilliant, and above all else, it's extremely fun. The monster is pretty, the lore is great, it's an easy S tier. Next up then is Elatrion in his new world glory. Some people got upset with his elemental damage requirements, but I actually think it's a cool way to represent his power as a black dragon. Black dragons should change the way that you play the game in order to defeat them. They should make you think differently. They should make you need to prepare, and Elatrion did all of that, no doubt about it. If you completely take away the element requirement mechanic, his actual fight, like the attacks that he uses, are really quite fun to dodge around. It's a nice collection of varied abilities. His design is nice, and in Iceborne they really give you enough detail to see just how gorgeous his scales are, which really adds a lot. Elatrion just is one of those full package monsters, really. With that, we then have Shara Ishvalda. Oh man, I will never forget my first experience with Shara Ishvalda. This creature completely floored me. I had no idea what to expect when I dropped down into that arena, but it wasn't a gigantic rock golem. And then a few minutes later into the fight, the rock golem sheds to reveal a tree-themed, almost demonic-looking creature that fires vibration beams, and it's all just so incredibly otherworldly. It feels intense as hell the whole time, the fight is fun, the creature is just cuckoo bananas, but in a good way that feels like a natural progression forwards that sort of makes sense, even if it's confusing. And he has more than one attack that I can point at and say, that is goddamn awesome. Rounding off the S tier then is Shagaru Magala. I'm not the biggest Magala fanboy personally, but I really do respect the creatures. I see where the love for them comes from, and I do think they are quite pretty. Please accept my peace offering, putting him in the S tier, and stop sending severed hammerheads to my door. Moving up to S+, Chameleos. I know, this was never my favorite monster before. He was quite quirky and neat, but his fight itself I found a little bit jarring, slow, and frustrating. In Rise, he is still a little bit frustrating, but I find him much more manageable manageable. He has some mechanics that are really cool to actually learn, and while he doesn't take your items anymore, he does take your Spirit Bird effects, which arguably is even more thematic to the game at hand. His invisibility is cooler than it ever has been before. I love how it's realized in Monster Hunter Rise, and even with all of his changes, he still feels like he has the soul and personality that Chameleos has always had. Finally then, rounding off the list as a whole, Namielle. This is my favorite Elder Dragon just overall. Some people hate the fight. I think it's amazing. Some people think she looks ugly, but I think this creature is freaking awesome. It's an amalgamation of sea creatures turned into a land creature that creates puddles in a map that is essentially a waterless ocean. The gravitas of the entire situation makes it feel like for a third of the entire game you have been walking around within her domain and she has just silently allowed you to do it before waiting to pounce upon you. That fight I really like. She really plays around a lot with the water and the lightning mechanics, and I love it when a monster mixes elements together within their own attacks to change the way that the element works. Essentially, she uses water and thunder together to make an offshoot of blast in the way that it actually functions within the fight. I will personally just never get sick of this fight, just as I will never get sick of the creature it is attached to. Namielle just is my #1 Elder Dragon. Alright everyone, I've been Cotton Dinosaur, and this has been my personal tier list of the Elder Dragons in the Monster Hunter series. Do you agree with my decisions? What monsters would you shuffle around on this list, and to where? Like if you like the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet. Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.